It's really great. Again, thanks for the invitation. These have been really fascinating talks. I've really enjoyed listening to hearing things. I hope that the various comments and resources I've put in the chat have been helpful and not intrusive, but they really touch on a lot of different issues in the broad world of science communication. I want to begin with a land acknowledgement. I'm speaking to you from my home in Ithaca, New York. Both my home and my institution, Cornell University, are located on the traditional homelands of the Gayokono, the Cayuga Nation. The Gayokono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on these lands. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, Ithaca, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Gayokono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of the Gayokono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. What's important about reading and land acknowledgement is not that it's a formula that we now just stick at the beginning of a talk, but it's something that reminds us of, or gives us an opportunity to reflect on a variety of issues about the resources we're building on and the obligations we have to the people around us. And I think that kind of reflection is really critical in a field like science communication, where we are just beginning to bring lots of things together and where we're beginning to recognize some of what we've left out. And so for me, having a land acknowledgement is actually a powerful part of thinking about my own professional work. To begin, we have to think about, well, I've used this term science communication. What do I mean by that? Typically, when you hear the word science communication, you think of it as this linear process, right? You do whatever you do in the lab or the field. You go to meetings and you present. Depending on your field, you may circulate preprints. There's some grant activity that happens both before and after, and so on. But finally, it gets published in the formal paper. And when that happens, that's when it's science, right? Is when it's formally in that paper. And then it goes out into the media or into the textbooks or into the classrooms or into the policy world, or all of the various things that we've heard about today. It turns out when you do research on the field that it's a little more complicated than that. Don't worry about the exact details of this. I think you can still see, I think you can see my cursor, you can still see the lab and the field, and there's journals, and it goes out to the news media, but there's all kinds of other ways that information flows. If you give a talk, there may be a reporter there who writes about it, or maybe a policymaker hears about it, or you build an exhibit for a museum, and that gets talked about in a church basement, which then leads to some kind of general public discussion. If you're doing work that is environmental or ecological, you may be at a nature center and have people directly asking you questions about your work. All these ways in which these things interact. And you'll also notice that the arrows are double-ended. Information flows in all kinds of directions. And so these various public interactions are as fundamental to the flow of information in science as that linear process, which is in there, but it's a lot messier. Depending on the resolution on your screen, you may be able to see an XYZ axis in there. I call this the sphere of science communication. It's, as I say, the details aren't important. It's the conception of science communication as being this multi-dimensional, multi-directional kind of thing. Now, already in this talk, I've used the terms science communication and public engagement with science. There's a third term that gets used to describe this called informal science education. And as this diagram that was prepared a couple of years ago by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences shows, there's tremendous overlap between these fields. And if we don't want to get too caught up in precisely which label are we using. But it is a little bit helpful to see what some of the differences are, to understand why people are using these different labels. So some people are thinking more on the educational side. These are often people in museums, but not always. Often after school programs or educational documentaries, they're trying to teach, they want people to learn something. There's a separate world, the science communication side, that tends to be the journalists, the institutional public information officers, and yes, your institution has one. That's a direct quote from a PhD comic that everybody should know about. I should have provided a link to that. And the whole thing is often goes under the label of public engagement, and those things in between the informal science ed and the science comm often are ones that carry all three labels: public engagement, ISE, SciComm. We could have endless arguments about where to put these things, but I think it's important to recognize these overlaps and so forth, and to recognize that this has been going on for a long time. So here are two kinds of public events. One is a lecture by Michael Faraday, Sir Michael Faraday, at the Royal Society in London. We can't quite tell, but over on the far left is Prince Albert, the husband of Queen Victoria. This was something the elites did. This was something that you were supposed to do, was listen to experts. A more modern science fair, Maker Fest happening there. This happens to be the Philadelphia Science Festival. Kids interacting, working with some of those kits that we just heard about, and so on. There's also a lot of just delivery of information, sometimes with opportunities for feedback. So if you think about the Facebook site IFLS, as the woman who started it says, I will say the full name once: I fucking love science. I won't say it again because I don't know who I've just offended. But I don't know, the last time I checked, there were 25 million subscribers, which means that when you count all the people who then follow on feeds, there are 70 million people who see a post there. Emily Grassley's Brain Scoop, she worked for the Field Museum for about 7 years, doing a wonderful YouTube series exploring various topics. And of course, there's discussion that would then happen in the comments section. I pointed to the Philadelphia Science Festival. There's the World Science Festival in New York. There are science festivals all around the country. We now have a much more kind of interactive way. And so part of the question is, how did we get here? And why am I saying that science, the practice of science, has public engagement built in? I think it's easiest to see that if we think especially about museums. Museums which started in the 15th or 16th century were called originally cabinets of curiosities. They were just collections of odd things: rocks, feathers, two-headed goats, whatever people found, they would put together. And it wasn't until about 200 years ago that people started trying to organize them, and we began to get something that where there was systematic knowledge. And interestingly, one of the first and most famous of the museums in the U.S., Peale's Museum, used the Linnaean system as a way of organizing what was being presented. But there was still this question of, is this about doing research or is this about doing public presentation? Two of the most famous of our museums, the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, or the American Museum of Natural History in New York, notice the language there. The Smithsonian was created for the increase, that is research, and diffusion, public display of knowledge. And the history of the Smithsonian is that in its early years, it was all about research. There was very little public display. There was a lot of tension around that. Eventually, it became the mix that we have today of both the very famous museums, but also world quality research sites as well. Similarly, the American Museum of Natural History was originally created just for research purposes, to house research collections. And the very famous public displays that they have came along later. Also, if we're thinking in the 19th century, we begin to get much more of an education for the masses. When I showed the Faraday drawing, remember I said it was for the elites. Through the 19th century, there's much more attention to public schooling. There are public lecturers, the media, the newspapers become available to ordinary people around mid-century, partly because literacy becomes more common, but also partly because the printing process changed and you could produce a newspaper for a penny, or magazines intended for inventors and so on. But one of the challenges here was, are we trying to provide information or are we trying to provide spectacle? And this was another one of these constant tensions that is part of the field. By the beginning of the 20th century, we started having much more professionalization. So you had public health campaigns and people who specialized in public health. Obviously, we see that again now, 100 years later. This was tuberculosis. There were some of the original vaccine campaigns were around that time. We also got people who had the profession of science communicator. This is E.E. Slauson, trained as a chemist, wrote a textbook called Creative Chemistry that was available in most high schools in the country, and eventually became the first editor of something called Science Newsletter. It's still published. It's called Science News today. And was originally created as a way of distributing science news to newspapers around the country. Eventually, some of its activities changed, but many of them are still involve various kinds of science outreach. What's important partly about this period is that science was really seen almost entirely as a positive thing. Science was for progress. And so science was idealized and science was held up literally almost like a religion. The fact that these science museums are such monumental buildings is not accidental. They were intended to show the value of science. There were people who moved around between them. Waldemar Kempfert was an editor at Popular Science Monthly. He was the first director of the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry. He ended up spending about 30 years as the science editor of the New York Times. I don't know if you'll be able to see this, but his papers recently got donated to Cornell. This is one of his awards that he got, a big statuette that they donated his papers. They gave us that as well. It's very heavy. That belief in progress was part of the culture of mid-century, mid-20th century United States. This is the frontispiece for a book called Man in a Chemical World. And it says, chemical industry upheld by pure science. Unfortunately, I've got something covering this. Hold on a second. Chemical industry upheld by pure science sustains the production of man's necessity. We'll set aside the gendered issue right now. But you can see that idea of progress. But there have always been, especially, in the 20th century, concerns about the effects of science and technology. So early in the century, worries that industrialization and that came with technology was leading to people being literally crushed. So Charlie Chaplin in Modern Times. With the arrival of nuclear weapons and at the end of World War II, people were worried about what would happen if we had a nuclear war. This poster about what to do if you see a flash of light. I'm old enough that I remember in school being told what to do in terms of if there was a nuclear attack. Today, we know there's nothing you can do. The environmental movement, now more than 50 years old, was very much about critique of some of what happens in science and technology. And this is part of what led to this recognition of the science and society interactions is part of what led to the real fluorescence of a lot of outreach especially beginning in the 1980s, where you got popular science magazines and television shows and popular science books and plays, and it became something that was more clearly a part of our culture. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip that one, just go directly here. These issues were wicked problems. This actually is a slide I originally prepared some years ago, where vaccines and autism was a wicked problem. Now, obviously, I have to add COVID to that. The point is, these are issues that involve much more than just the science. These are problems that involve technical questions, policy questions, personal values, religious commitments, concerns about the world changing too fast, all kinds of new and emerging technologies or diseases, things that change. These are problems for which there is no simple answer. And so they are wicked problems. So how can you deal with that? And what we've learned in the last 30 years as scholars is that there's two basic approaches to addressing these. One is what's usually called the information delivery or deficit model mode. This is deliver information, whether it's about climate or science education or evolution or about vaccines. People saying, here's the information you need to know. The problem is we've learned that that's not always, in fact, frequently not how we address public concerns, because there are often very good reasons that communities are questioning science. The most obvious case here is the question of vaccine use in the African American community in the case of COVID. As many of you know, there's a terrible history of racism in institutionalized medicine. The Tuskegee experiments of the 1930s through the 1960s, actually 1972 before it formally ended. There are very good reasons why people in the African American community would be suspicious of institutionalized medicine, and therefore there needs to be various kinds of discussion to build trust, to understand what people's concerns are, and to figure out how you can find common ground. Now, in the research world, we talk about these as separate things. There's the information delivery or deficit model, and there's various kinds of public engagement models. That's a whole nother talk, talking about all these models. The part of the issue here that you as people moving into this field have to think about is that in the real world, these models are all mixed together. In terms of what you actually do in any given situation, yes, you're delivering information, but you're also trying to stimulate conversation and so forth. So I said in the title that I would try to think about the future of public engagement and why I think it will remain part of science. It's because for dealing with wicked problems, you always have to have public engagement, which means there will be more dialogue, more recognition, I think, of the complex social dimensions. I heard Faneuil use the co-production term earlier, that science and society are put together, are co-produced. We will need more research on what the effects of particular projects are or what some of the issues are. Again, I could talk for hours about that. And we need more people out there practicing.